Hello, hopefully you can hear us okay.
Hi everyone, my name is Erica Hensens. I'm the Director of Academic Quality and Standards here at the University of Dundee.
And I'm Naomi Jeffery, I'm in Strategic Planning here at Dundee. So without further ado, we'll get started. We're talking today about the Data Landscape Project. We are, as a sector, are awash with data. We've got internal data, we've got data that's been gathered by HESA, we've got analyses that have been published by the Office for Students, by Wonky, by the rest of the press, and it can be really difficult to know what to read, what to focus on, and how that data can help us answer the important questions for us and for our institutions. There are many questions that the data about HE can help us to answer. For example, we might need to know whether a particular programme is performing well. The Data Landscape Project and the resource that we've created is about helping everyone in HE to answer these questions. All of us are on a different journey, but often there are others who are heading in the same direction as us, so we can learn from one another. So who is we? Well, as part of the sector response to the QAA Scotland enhancement theme, a small group of planners from across Scotland was commissioned to build this data landscape resource. I'm one of the group. The others, as you can see listed there, are Gavin Lee from University of West of Scotland, James Gorman, Strathclyde, Laura Knox from St Andrews, and Susan Fish from the Open University in Scotland. And M. Bailey, I apologise, I missed her name at the top of the list, from Heriot-Watt. None of the others, unfortunately, have been able to join us today, but they've contributed, obviously, equally to this project. In addition to the planners who've been working on the projects directly, we've also had contributions from many others across the sector as consultation, particularly for how this data landscape can be applied to quality assurance and quality enhancement. One of the people included in that consultation is Erica Hensens, formerly of Stirling University and now who's joined us at Dundee, who I'm delighted to say is with me today. Erica's going to tell us a little bit more about her work on quality assurance and quality enhancement a bit later in the presentation, and she's going to talk a bit about how the landscape project relates to her role and more broadly to how it relates to quality across higher education. So the first aim of the data landscape project is to help to support quality processes and programs. For example, if you were reviewing a study program, how would you know if it was performing well? How would you navigate through that sea of data? In other words, what data do you need to help you answer the questions that you need answered? So the first section of the data landscape resource is designed to help answer these sorts of questions. We considered the purpose of the data and looked at it from an quality assurance and enhancement perspective. The anticipated end users for this section of the resource are academics with learning and teaching leadership responsibilities. For example, programme leaders, assistant deans for learning and teaching, directors of quality, and so on. To help you find your way into the data, we consider the purposes and processes all universities must undertake, and we built guidance around those. In other words, you know the QA/QE processes that you want to undertake, and this resource is intended to guide you to the most relevant and important information that you need. But this sea of data isn't a bad thing, and the second aim of the landscape is to help you explore the data that's available and how it might be able to help you. So the first part of that is the data sources. This is a guide to information about specific HE data sources, and at the moment this covers the HESA performance indicators, the National Student Survey, the International Student Barometer, the Postgraduate Taught Experience and Postgraduate Research Experience surveys, and the destination of levers for higher education. All of those are just acronyms in the presentation, but in the landscape resource itself, it goes into the full text of those. And I'll talk a bit more about Delhi a little bit further in the presentation. The resources that we've created try to make these sources as comprehensive and useful as possible. They include informal guidance on aspects like the limitations of the data and some historical information, for example, that the NSS questions changed in 2017, so earlier analysis will look different. The second section about data resources is about data collections. So we recognised that some of the terminology that's used in HE is often used without explanation. So we've tried to guide as to who would own, control and report on the types of data. And this at the moment includes the HESA data returns, which are institutional data reported by each university to HESA on a mandatory annual basis. And that data is published in part through the HIDE system and also through other performance indicators, which are listed in the sources there. The third section of information about data sources in the landscape is about data applications. So this is giving you a steer on when information about the sector is reported, predominantly to inform prospective students about the university. So the aim of this aspect is to help academic colleagues to understand where the data feeds through to beyond the departments and beyond the university. And at the moment, those applications include the UK League Tables, the International League Tables, the Research Excellence Framework, the Teaching Excellence Framework, Unistats and SFC outcome agreements, which are obviously only relevant for the Scottish sector in particular. And I'll talk through one example in a bit more detail. So if we look specifically at the National Student Survey, the NSS. The NSS is one of the data sources for which we produced an information sheet. And the information sheet talks through the type and scope of the data, that it's a survey of final year students about their study experience. At the time period of data renewal, i.e. that it's run annually. The questions it can help to explore or answer, that it can be used to review and drive development of curriculum and other aspects of student experience. Important caveats, exclusions, etc. And this mentions that the survey underwent a significant review and revision in 2017, so results earlier than that are not comparable. And finally, it talks about publications and analyses which use this data. The NSS is used for league tables. It also feeds into the Teaching Excellence Framework, the TEF, and it's also used in the SFC outcome agreements, among others. And finally, where to find the data and further analysis, there is a link provided to where you can find the NSS data. All of this information and more is shown in the information sheet about the National Student Survey. So next we're going to go and have a look at the data landscape resource. So I'm going to open up a web browser and just scroll through the resource itself with you now to give you a brief overview. So bear with me while I switch over to the website. I know this takes a few seconds to load, but I hope that this should now be visible to everyone. So this website, as you can see at the address bar at the top, is on the Enhancement Themes website. And if you go to the main Enhancement Themes website and the current enhancement theme, within Defining and Capturing Evidence, we've got the HE Data Landscape resource. The page talks briefly about the project at the top of the page and then goes into how the data landscape resource can be used, and then goes straight into the different quality activities about which we've gathered the types of data that you might use. So if we look, for instance, at institution-led review, there's a brief introduction about what the institution-led review is, and then it goes into the various types of data that you might use. And obviously, all of these sections of the resource are interlinked. So the National Student Survey, as you can see, is one of the links that's available on the section on institutional-led review. If we scroll down a bit further, it then goes into the various resources and the 3 sections that I mentioned. So if we have a look at the data source guide, the National Student Survey is there as well. And that file that's linked there is the same one as you see in the institutional-led review. So the way that we structured the web resource is so that you can either look at it from the perspective of the type of data that you're interested in. So if somebody says to you, oh yes, it's the NSS that you want to look at, you can go straight to an information sheet specifically about the NSS. Or if you're considering the types of data that you need for a purpose, you can take that approach as well, and it will point you to the same types of information about the NSS, but in the context of the task that you're looking at performing. So we hope that these 2 different approaches will help to provide information in the 2 different kinds of ways that you might approach this. Okay. There will be time for questions in just a moment. So I'm going to skip quickly back to the presentation. Right, okay, brilliant. So I think we're back to the slides now. Okay, and I'm going to hand over now to Erica, who's going to talk a bit about quality and how the data landscape resource relates to her work.
Thank you very much, Naomi. I would like to start with a big thank you to all of the group who have put in so much work to developing this resource. I think it's something that's going to be really useful for practitioners, both who are working within the realms of quality enhancement and assurance, but also those practitioners who are really working at the coalface in terms of programme delivery and enhancement of the student experience. For me, there are 4 key areas in which this information can really be put to use. And I think what's incredibly helpful about the resource that's been developed is that it's accessible to everybody. And one of the key things for me is around induction and training, particularly of new staff joining higher education perhaps for the first time or joining a new institution, will be particularly helpful for them, and supporting an induction process that allows them to really understand the context in which they're working. It can also support staff to understand the broader landscape in which they're working, not to flog a metaphor too much. But I think in terms of the activities that we undertake, we're all aware that there's an increasing need for us to be cognizant of the context in which we're working, both within our institutions, so school to school, faculty to faculty, but also cross-institutionally, both within our local areas, within the 4 nations of the UK, but as well as beyond. So benchmarking is a crucial use for this information. It can really support decision making. And as Naomi has already said, it might be something like considering whether a new programme is worth pursuing and developing, or it could be considering a new partnership, either locally or internationally. And the information that's provided could be used both by the home institution who's exploring that partnership, but also by the potential partner to better understand the institution with whom they might be partnering. Engagement and discussion is really the crux of how we take forward an enhancement-led approach. And engagement with our students and engagement with our external partners is crucial to many of the activities that are listed in the landscape tool. That engagement can be supported by data, but only really where that data is turned into information and is made useful for those who are reading it and understanding it. Now, for those of us who are lucky enough to work in data and planning and quality assurance on a day-to-day basis, a lot of these tools are very familiar to us. But I have to admit that my knowledge of all of these tools is not as in-depth as it could be, and this is going to be a really useful tool for me as a practitioner. But I would really anticipate that for perhaps class representatives who have been asked to participate in a periodic review of a programme, and they've been asked to look at swathes of data from National Student Survey or Postgraduate Taught Experience Survey, that this might be a tool that we could point them to that will help them answer questions about the basics of what these tools are and the information that it's telling them, and perhaps the questions they want to ask of the data and information that they've been presented with. And that leads on to the fourth and final area, which is around reflection and enhancement. Breaking down all of the information that we receive is a really crucial part of both how we communicate internally within an organisation, but also how we work externally as well. It might take us beyond discipline and institutional boundaries. I hope it will help us reflect on where we can develop the student experience in particular, but to support everyone who's engaged in enhancing our institutional work in a way that allows us to have a level playing field in terms of understanding the data and to be able to access it in a meaningful way as well. I'd be very happy to take questions on more specific elements of how we might use data in the Q&A session later. But for the time being, I'll hand over to Naomi.
Thank you very much, Erica. I think that was really helpful. And as Erica says, there's no point in us having this data unless we can turn it into information and help it to answer questions. So Erica's help on developing the application section of the website has been invaluable. We're very grateful to her and to the others who contributed for that. So there's nothing else that I wanted to say just now. I think it's over to you for questions and for your feedback. So please do use the conversation section, which we can see several people have already been using. Please do ask us any questions and any feedback that you have about the resources that currently stands or future developments that might help it to be more applicable for you in your context would be very welcome. Thank you. There's a question just come in. How do you plan to keep this up to date? That's a fantastic question, and I'm really glad that you've asked. So what next is something that we have been thinking about quite hard. The data landscape is always going to be changing, and we want and need to do different things over the coming months and years, and the data that's available to us will be changing. So an example of that is the Delhi survey, the destination of leavers from higher education, which many of you will know has now been replaced by the graduate outcomes survey, which is run differently and will provide different types of data. So for the data landscape to be a valuable resource, not just now, but in the future, we as a sector need to figure out how we're going to keep it up to date. QAA are hosting the data landscape on their website, which gives it a lasting home, which is great. But we still need to figure out how it can be not just maintained, but improved and expanded. And we would welcome any ideas from any of the people attending today for how we can go about that.
We've had a really interesting question about postgraduate taught in particular, but thinking about how we can access data at a level that is useful at programme level. And obviously for some of the data sources, it will be very much dependent on the size of your programmes, sample size of those who've responded, for particularly National Student Survey, etc. But there is an awful lot of information out there that can help you with the context in which your program is being run. And certainly for me, when I was managing a postgraduate talk program, it was that contextual information which for me was just as important as the information about my program. I worked with the local information that I had, so thinking about things like module evaluation surveys, for example. We also did a pulse check survey partway through the term, which was very informal. It was run by the students, but it provided a huge amount of rich data and information that I was able to use. And I contextualized that using things like the postgraduate talk experience survey, which allowed me to compare and contrast with other programs out there as well. So I think it's about finding the balance between your local information that you will gather as a day-to-day activity within your institution, as well as this institutional information. Naomi, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I guess I would add that there is the postgraduate taught experience survey, which there's an information sheet about. Now, not every institution partakes in the PTES survey, and I think there is an exploration going on to create an equivalent TPG survey to the National Student Survey, which would be undertaken by probably every institution in the UK. But I think that's probably 2 or 3 years away at a minimum. So if you don't already get involved in the PTES survey, that might be something to explore. There are also several institutions that run an internal survey already for talk postgraduate students, and there are lists, particularly I'm thinking of the planners message list, where people are really positive about helping others, and so you could put the word out and ask where there are other institutions running talk postgraduate surveys, what questions are they asking, which might help you to design a survey if you don't run the PTES that would help to answer those kinds of quality questions for yourselves. Okay, so how common is the phrase evidence-informed practice? Because that's what we're all doing regardless of data type. Yes, so I think it's an important point that we know that a lot of this data and evidence is already being used, and this isn't an attempt to teach people how to suck eggs. It's to help support development and maybe add some things that particular areas haven't considered before, but also to support, as Erica said, people coming new into HE. Or changing roles who might not be aware of the kind of evidence that's available to help support practice.
I think, Liz, it's a really good question. I think one of the challenges within higher education is not only do we have huge amounts of data and information, but we all have a slightly different way of talking about it. And I think it's a really interesting question, actually, that flags up a perennial issue for practitioners in higher education is about how do we open dialogue and discussion. Certainly for myself, having recently transitioned from the University of Stirling to the University of Dundee, we're not that many miles apart, but we use different language to talk about the same things. And hopefully this resource will take out some of the questions that people will have, and they can focus on that local contextualization without having to worry too much about the big questions about what the data is telling them. Thanks for the feedback from Sheila about widening participation particularly. That's really helpful. Okay. Any other questions that anyone would like to ask?
Or any suggestions about the big question of how we keep this up to date? Thank you very much for the positive feedback. That's very welcome. Okay, so there's a question there about how do you think you will use this within your institution? I think that's a question coming out to those who are in the webinar. I don't think that's a question directed to us, although we can answer it. It's already working on this resource has already been helpful for us in reflecting on what data we have available and whether we're using it to our best advantage.
And certainly areas that we would like to look at it from thinking purely from a quality assurance and enhancement point of view is how we can support those who are leading on work such as programme periodic reviews, annual programme reviews, really making sure that they're aware of this resource, that they understand that it can be used and how it can be used. And it will be interesting to see perhaps in a year's time the impact that this resource has had and how we can build on it from there. We'd be really interested to hear, though, if others have perhaps already been using it or have ideas of how they might use it in their home institution.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you need time to reflect on this or think about it or have maybe a longer comment or question to ask, which is difficult to type into a question box, please do get in touch with QAA, and I'm sure they would be happy to forward on those questions or comments to us.
Fiona's just mentioned about course reviews. I couldn't agree more. I think that's going to be a particularly valuable area in which this information can be used.
Okay, there's a question there. What are the biggest challenges to promote the use of evidence or data that you found in your institution? From a data perspective, I would say probably where there are differences in definitions. So one example for me would be the National Student Survey, which this year they've given us data not just by the JAX codes, but also by the new HECOS common aggregation hierarchy. And it's right that we need to move to the new structure, but I think there's been confusion, potential for confusion about how those different subjects are grouped. So trying to communicate clearly about why you're seeing slightly different numbers by those kinds of groupings is really important for us as a data team. Also, there's always a slight difference, I think, for any institution between the data that they see publicly reported back through HESA and the data that they might have internally because of the specific definitions that are standardized for HESA, whereas the definitions that make more sense to an individual institution to be used internally. So those are one of the aspects on which that being very clear about how those different definitions work and why you might see different numbers in different places is a challenge that you never quite get to the bottom of. But I think over time you get better at having different ways of handling it, and as an understanding of that is flows through an institution, it becomes more commonly understood.
I think also another element is really just understanding what we're talking about. And I think for many people, because of the nature of higher education, there will always be someone around the table who has not come across these data sets before. And that can be really challenging for them individually, but also for the group to have a quality discussion. And that's why, for me, the induction and training element usage of this information is going to be so crucial.